As my mother-in-law tallied the votes to kick me out, she still believed I was just a lucky small-town accountant. She did not know about the hidden slide in my presentation when the blue line of my net worth crossed double her son's gray line. Mrs. Cole gasped and collapsed before the steaming dinner. She never calculated that I was not begging to stay. I had secretly bought half their empire with my own money. My name is Natalie Ward, and as I sat at the foot of the 12-seat mahogany dining table, I realized that the only thing separating me from a carcass on a butcher block was my silk blouse. The air inside the Cole family lodge smelled of cedarwood, expensive pin noir, and the distinct metallic tang of betrayal. Outside the Florida ceiling windows, the wind howled off the Rockies, whipping the surface of the private lake into a black froth, but the atmosphere inside was far colder. We were 40 minutes outside of Denver, isolated in a luxury cabin that served as the venue for what my mother-in-law, Margaret Cole, had termed a family council. No children had been invited. This was strictly adult business. I looked down at the crystal glass of red wine in front of me. I had not taken a sip since we sat down at 7:00. The liquid was dark, still, and reflective, much like the eyes of the dozen people surrounding me. Every single person in this room carried the last name Cole, except for me. I was an anomaly. I was the variable in their equation that refused to balance. Margaret stood at the head of the table. She wore a cashmere cardigan the color of oatmeal, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She clasped her hands together, a gesture of pious concern that I knew hid a steel trap. "We are here," Margaret began, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the high ceiling room, "because we love Ethan and because we love this family." She paused for effect. I watched her scan the faces of her subjects. There was Richard, my father-in-law, staring intently at the grain of the wood table as if it contained the secrets of the universe, anything to avoid looking at me. There was Betsy, my sister-in-law, nervously twisting a diamond ring that I knew her mother had paid for. There were the cousins, a smattering of aunts and uncles, the entire gallery of beneficiaries who relied on the Cole Heritage Group to fund their Aspen ski trips and private school tuitions. And then there was Ethan. My husband sat to the right of his mother. He was 32 years old. Yet, in that moment, under the amber glow of the antler chandelier, he looked like a child called to the principal's office. He wore the blue sweater I had bought him for his birthday, the one that brought out the warmth in his eyes. But tonight his eyes were fixed on his empty plate. He was hunching forward, making himself small, shrinking away from the woman he married and toward the woman who signed his checks. The tension in Ethan and Natalie's marriage has become a disruption to the harmony of this family, Margaret continued. She spoke of my marriage as if it were a noise complaint or a zoning issue. We have tried to advise. We have tried to guide, but when one member of the family refuses to integrate, refuses to be transparent, we must take collective action. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, acidic and sharp. It was absurd. I was a legally married woman, a professional in the fintech industry, sitting through a performance review for my own life. It felt less like a family gathering and more like a shareholder meeting where I was the distressed asset they were looking to liquidate. "Tonight," Margaret announced, placing a small, heavy crystal box in the center of the table, "we are going to settle this. We will have a vote, a private, anonymous vote. The question is simple. Do we, the Cole family, support Natalie continuing as a member of this inner circle? Or do we believe it is time for Ethan to move on for the sake of his future?" The room went silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace in the corner. It was medieval. It was a stoning disguised as a democratic process. I looked at Ethan, willing him to look back. "Stand up," I screamed in my head. "Flip the table. Tell your mother she is insane. Take my hand and walk out to the car." Ethan shifted in his chair. He glanced at his mother, then at the box, and finally, for a split second, his gaze flickered to me. His eyes were wet, filled with a pathetic, pleading apology. He looked like a dog that had been kicked too many times to bite back. He did not say a word. The pain hit me then, a dull, heavy throb in the center of my chest. It was not the anger of the vote that hurt. It was the silence of the man who had vowed to protect me. But beneath the pain, something else was hardening. A cold metallic resolve was solidifying in my veins, replacing the heartbreak with calculation. "Before we vote," Margaret said, picking up a piece of heavy cardstock, "I want to remind everyone of why we are here. This is not about malice. This is about protection." She began to read the charges. It was a litany of sins that sounded reasonable only to people who had never earned a paycheck they did not inherit. First, Margaret said, Natalie's refusal to prioritize the family over her career, her insistence on maintaining her position at Northline Quantum Capital, despite our offers to find her a more suitable, less demanding role within the family foundation, shows a lack of commitment to her domestic duties. I kept my face blank. My job at Northline was not just a job. It was a career. I had clawed my way into building algorithms that predicted market shifts while these people were still debating which country club to join. Second, she continued, her voice gaining strength, financial secrecy. Natalie has consistently refused to merge her assets with the family trust. She has refused to allow me, as the family financial steward, to audit her accounts for tax deficiency. This lack of transparency endangers us all. We do not know what liabilities she carries. We do not know what debts she hides. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Debts. If only she knew. And finally Margaret concluded, lowering the paper, a general lack of respect for the cold traditions, the refusal to conform, arrogance. She looked directly at me then. It was a look of pure triumph. She thought she had won. She thought I was the poor girl from the Midwest who had scraped her way into their golden circle, and was now being evicted because I did not know my place. "We will now vote," Margaret said. "Please write yes to keep Natalie, or no to ask her to leave." She passed out slips of paper and silver pens. I watched the farce unfold with the detached focus of a scientist observing lab rats. Uncle Robert, who had borrowed $20,000 from Ethan last year for a business venture that never launched, scribbled quickly and folded his paper. He would vote no. He needed Margaret to keep signing his allowance checks. Betsy, who complained to me privately about how suffocating her mother was, looked at Margaret's stern face and bent at her paper. She wrote 2 letters. No, fear was a powerful motivator. One by one, they stood up and walked to the crystal box, dropping their judgments inside. The soft shush of paper sliding against glass was the only sound in the room. Then it was Ethan's turn. My husband stood up. His leg seemed unsteady. He walked to the center of the room. He held his pen over the paper for a long time. I saw his hand trembling. He was sweating despite the chill in the room. He looked at me one last time, a look of utter defeat, and then he wrote his answer. He folded the paper twice, dropped it into the box, and returned to his seat without lifting his head. He had voted. He had participated in the tribunal. That was the moment the marriage ended. Not on paper, not legally, but in reality. The Ethan I love had died the moment he dropped that slip of paper into the glass coffin. Margaret smiled. It was a benevolent, terrifying smile. "Thank you, everyone. I will now tally the votes." She reached for the box. "Wait," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor wire. Margaret froze. She looked at me, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Natalie, I really do not think this is the time for a rebuttal. The family has spoken." "Actually," I said, reaching down to the floor beside my chair, "I think the family has voted, but they have not spoken. Not yet, because they do not have all the data." I lifted my laptop onto the table. It was a sleek silver machine, sticker-free, strictly professional. I opened the lid. The screen glowed blue, illuminating my face. "You invited me here for a financial review," I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "You accused me of financial secrecy. You accused me of being a liability." I plugged the HDMI cable into the port on the side of my computer. The large television screen mounted above the stone fireplace flickered to life. "So," I said, looking straight at Margaret, "I decided to agree with you. Transparency is important, essential even." "Natalie, what are you doing?" Ethan whispered, his voice. "Please don't make a scene." "I am not making a scene, Ethan," I replied, my voice steady, devoid of emotion. "I am making a presentation." On the screen, a title slide appeared in elegant minimalist font. Cole family financial overview. Margaret scoffed. We already have accountants, Natalie. We do not need your little spreadsheets. Oh, these aren't just spreadsheets, Margaret. I said, my finger poised over the arrow key. This is a reality check. You made me a line item on your ledger. You wanted to calculate my value to this family. So I did the math for you. I looked around the table. I saw confusion in Richard's eyes, annoyance in Betsy's, and pure unadulterated panic starting to dawn on Margaret's face. She did not know what was coming, but her predator's instinct told her the wind had just shifted. You all just voted on whether I can afford to stay in this family, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold, hard voice I used in boardrooms when I was about to acquire a company and dismantle it. But the real question you should have been asking is whether this family can afford to lose me. I pressed the enter key. The first slide transitioned. The room went deadly quiet. If they wanted a show, I would give them one. But they had forgotten the most basic rule of finance. Never underestimate the silent partner, and certainly never ever bet against the person who controls the data. To understand why I did not crumble when the Cole family voted on my existence like a zoning ordinance, you have to understand where I came from. I was not bred in a boardroom. I was forged in the humid cornfield flatness of a small town in the Midwest, where the biggest employer was a cardboard box factory and people considered a dinner at Olive Garden to be high society. My parents divorced when I was 12. It was a civilized split, or so they claimed. But I learned early on that civilized is just a polite word for financially devastating. I watched my mother, a woman with a degree in literature she never used, struggled to balance a checkbook that was always bleeding red. I saw her ask my father for money to buy my school shoes, her voice shrinking until it was barely a whisper. That was the variable that defined my life equation. I swore to myself, at 12 years old, watching my mother cry over a utility bill, that I would never ever have to ask anyone for permission to exist. I did not have a trust fund. I had a work ethic that bordered on masochism. By the time I hit college, I had turned myself into a machine. I dual majored in finance and data science because I realized that numbers were the only language that did not lie. People lied, emotions lied, but compound interest was a universal truth. I worked 3 jobs while taking 18 credits a semester. I shelved books in the library at 6:00 in the morning, tutored failing fraternity brothers in statistics in the afternoon, and waited tables at a dive bar until 2 in the morning. I remember my junior year boyfriend breaking up with me in the parking lot of that dive bar. He told me I was too ambitious. He said I looked at the world like it was a spreadsheet to be balanced. I remember staring at him exhausted, smelling like stale beer and fried grease, and thinking that he was absolutely right. He saw it as a floor. I saw it as a survival strategy. I let him walk away, and then I went home and studied for my econometrics final. When I graduated, I had $40,000 in student loans and a job offer from Northline Quantum Capital in Austin. Northline was not a bank. It was a predator in the fintech jungle. We built models to predict risk in volatile markets. I spent my days staring at lines of code and market trends, hunting for patterns in the chaos. I was good at it. I was very good at it. While my peers were buying leased BMWs with their first bonuses to look the part, I lived in a studio apartment the size of a walk-in closet and ate ramen noodles. I took every bonus, every stock auction, and every spare dollar and threw it into the market. I did not gamble on crypto or meme stocks. I bought boring, reliable index funds. I bought into the energy sector. I bought into tech infrastructure. I watched my net worth grow from minus 40,000 to 0, and that 0 felt like winning the lottery. Then it went positive. By the time I was 26, I had saved enough for a 20% down payment on a modest 2-bedroom condo in downtown Austin. It was not a mansion. The floors were laminate, not hardwood, and the view was of a parking garage, not a lake, but the deed had my name on it, just my name, Natalie Ward. When I signed those papers, I felt a rush of dopamine stronger than any drug. I had built a fortress. It was small, but it was mine. That was the version of me that walked into a community finance seminar on a rainy Tuesday evening. I was not looking for romance. I was looking for tax strategies. The speaker was a bloating man in a cheap suit talking about inflation hedges. He was wrong about the consumer price index impact on housing starts, and I, unable to help myself, raised my hand and corrected him with 3 cited sources. After the seminar, a man in a charcoal sweater approached me. He had messy brown hair, glasses that slid down his nose, and a smile that looked genuinely amused. "That was quite a takedown," he said. "I think you made him cry." "I'm Natalie," I said, extending a hand. "I hate bad data." "I'm Ethan," he replied. "I'm just here because I think I'm supposed to be an adult now, but I have no idea what I'm doing." Ethan Cole was everything I was not. He was an interior architect at Blue Compass Studio. He saw the world in textures, light, and negative space. He was warm. He was funny. He was incredibly charmingly bad with money. On our second date, his card was declined for a $1.20 pizza because he had forgotten to transfer funds from his savings. He turned bright red. I just laughed and paid the bill. We fell in love over cheap food, trucks, and long walks around Ladybird Lake. I loved him because he softened my edges. He made me stop calculating long enough to look at the sunset. He made me feel safe in a way that had nothing to do with a bank balance. We had been dating for 6 months before I realized that his financial cluelessness was not because he was poor. It was because he had never needed to know how money worked. He finally told me about his family one night while we were sitting on my cheap IKEA couch. He explained that he was a Cole, the Cole Heritage Group. It was a name I vaguely recognized from strip malls and construction sites across the Midwest. They owned a chain of hardware supply stores and a massive portfolio of commercial real estate. "I'm disappointed," Ethan joked, tracing patterns on my hand. "My brother runs the operations. My sister married a developer. I just wanted to design living rooms. My mother handles everything else. She is like the CFO, but scary." I laughed it off. I thought he was exaggerating. Then came the invitation to meet the parents. The dinner was not at a house. It was at an estate. The driveway was long enough to have its own zip code. When we walked through the double oak doors, the air changed. It was cooler, conditioned to preserve antique furniture and old money. Margaret Cole was waiting for us in the drawing room. She did not hug Ethan. She offered him a cheek. When she turned to me, I felt a physical drop in temperature. She was a beautiful woman in a severe way, dressed in silk that cost more than my first car. Her eyes were gray, sharp, and assessing. She did not look at my face first. She looked at my shoes. They were practical heels, a mid-range department store brand. Then she looked at my bag. It was leather, but not a designer label. In 3 seconds, she had priced me, and in her estimation, I was a penny stock. "So this is Natalie," she said. Her voice was smooth, like velvet wrapped around a knife handle. "Ethan tells me you work in computers." "Finance, actually," I corrected, keeping my voice level. "Fintech. I build risk analysis models." "How fascinating," Margaret said in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "We usually hire people to handle that sort of drudgery, so we do not have to think about it. Please sit. I want to know everything about your little life." We sat down to dinner. The table was set with enough silverware to perform a major surgery. Throughout the meal, poached salmon that tasted like water and money. Margaret interrogated me. Where was I from? Who were my people? Oh, divorced. How tragic. And where did I live? An apartment. How quaint. She dominated the conversation, cutting Ethan off whenever he tried to speak, correcting his posture and answering for him. I watched the way Ethan shrank in her presence. He reverted to being a child, and I watched the way she watched me. It was not just dislike. It was suspicious. She saw a girl from nowhere with a cheap handbag and a degree in math, and she did not see a daughter-in-law. She saw a line item. She saw a potential unauthorized withdrawal when the check came, metaphorically speaking. As the staff cleared the plates, Margaret leaned forward. "Ethan is a sensitive soul," she told me, swirling her wine. "He needs a lot of support. The Cole family is very protective of its own. We have high standards for those who wish to join our circle. I love your son, Mrs. Cole," I said, meeting her gaze without blinking. "I am not interested in your circle. I am interested in him." She smiled, then a tight, thin stretching of lips. "We shall see," she said. "Love is lovely, dear, but life stole. That is what truly matters in the long run." As we drove away that night in Ethan's sensible sedan, he apologized for her intensity. He said she just cared too much. But I looked out the window at the receding gates of the estate, and my risk analysis model was already running in my head. Probability of conflict 100%, projected losses if I was not careful, everything. I knew then that I was not just dating a man. I was entering a hostile takeover bid, and Margaret Cole had no idea that she had just invited a shark into her goldfish pond. Ethan asked me to marry him on the roof of a bar called the Rusty Nail. It was not the kind of place you found on Instagram. The plastic chairs were bleached by the sun. The wind was whipping my hair into a chaotic mess. And the only other people, there were two college students arguing about philosophy in the corner. He did not have a string quartet. He did not have a hidden photographer. He just had a ring box that he fumbled out of his pocket and a question that he stammered through because he was shivering from the nerves. "I love you," he said, his voice cracking. "I do not want to do this life with anyone else. You make me brave, Nat." I said yes before he even finished the sentence. At that moment, looking at the city lights of Austin blinking below us, I believed him. I believed that we were a team. I believed that the two of us could build something that had nothing to do with the suffocating weight of his last name. I looked at the ring, a modest vintage stone that he had bought with his own savings, and I felt like I had won the only lottery that mattered. But a fairy tale in the Cole family does not end with a kiss. It ends with a contract. When we broke the news to Margaret the following weekend, the air in the drawing room shifted. For a brief second, I saw a flicker of genuine annoyance cross her face, as if we had inconvenienced her schedule. Then the mask slipped back into place. "Oh, Ethan," she said, offering him a stiff hug. "Finally, I was beginning to worry you would wait until you were 40. She turned to me. She did not hug me. She took my hand, her fingers cold and dry, and looked at the engagement ring. "Charming," she said. "A bit small for a cold bride, but I suppose it has character." Then came the pivot. Before we could even finish our champagne, Margaret had already taken over. She insisted that the wedding be held at the Briarwood Country Club. She insisted that the guest list would need to include the governor, the board members of the Cole Heritage Group, and people Ethan had not seen since he was 5 years old. "We want to give you a start worthy of the family," she told us. "Do not worry about the cost. The family will handle everything." I tried to protest. I wanted a small ceremony. I wanted tacos in a jazz band. But Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. "Let her have this," he whispered to me later. "It is the only way to keep the peace. If we reject her money, she will make our lives miserable." So I agreed. I let her turn our wedding into a networking event. I told myself it was just one day. I did not realize that the wedding was just the opening ceremony for the real game. 3 weeks before the date, a courier arrived at my apartment. He handed me a thick, heavy envelope embossed with the logo of a law firm that charged more per hour than I used to make in a month. Inside was a prenuptial agreement. I called Ethan immediately. He sounded mortified. "Mom says it is standard." He stammered. "She says it is to protect me." "I mean protect us because you work in fintech. She says startups are high risk and she does not want the family assets exposed to potential lawsuits if your company goes under." I hung up the phone and sat on my floor reading the document. It was 50 pages long. Margaret had framed this as a shield for Ethan, but as I read through the legalese, I realized it was actually a cage for me. The language was predatory. There was a clause 14b, that stated any assets acquired during the marriage would be presumed to be derived from Cole family capital unless irrefutably proven otherwise. It meant that if I built a company, sold it, and made millions, Margaret could argue that I used Ethan's lifestyle to support me, and therefore the money belonged to the family trust. It was not protection. It was an acquisition strategy. I did not cry. I did not scream at Ethan. Instead, I took $5,000 out of my savings account and hired David, a divorce attorney who was known for being a pit bull in a cheap suit. David read the document and whistled low. "This is nasty," he said. "They are trying to proclaim your future earnings. They think you are going to be a housewife. Natalie, they want to make sure that if you ever leave, you leave naked." We spent 3 nights redlining the document. I struck out clause 14b. I added an appendix, the ward annex. It stipulated that any income I earned from my employment, any equity I held in any company, and any investments made in my name remained my sole and separate property. I also added a clause that stated I had no claim to the Cole inheritance, which was the bait they expected me to take. I was telling them, keep your money. Just keep your hands off mine. The confrontation happened over Sunday brunch. The table was set with fresh flowers and silver platters of pastries. I waited until the coffee was poured before I pulled the revised contract out of my bag and slid it across the mahogany table toward Margaret. "What is this?" she asked, her smile tight. "I had my lawyer review the agreement," I said, my voice calm. "We made some adjustments to better reflect the reality of our careers." Margaret picked up the document as she flipped through the pages and saw the sea of red ink. Her face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. "This is unacceptable," she hissed. "You are striking out the protections for the family estate. I am striking out the clauses that allow the family estate to cannibalize my hard work." I corrected. "I am happy to sign away any claim to Ethan's trust fund." "Margaret, I do not want it, but what I build is mine, and what Ethan builds is his." "That is fair." She slammed the paper down. "Ethan," she snapped, "are you going to let her dictate terms to us? She is bringing nothing into this marriage but debt and ambition. We are trying to protect you." I looked at Ethan. This was the test. The air in the room was so thick it felt like we were underwater. Ethan looked at his mother, red-faced and furious. And then he looked at me. I kept my face neutral, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. If he folded now, I would walk. I would leave the ring on the table and never look back. Ethan took a deep breath. He reached out and took the contract from his mother. He pretended to read it, though I knew he was just buying time. "It looks fair, Mom," he said quietly. Margaret stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "Excuse me," she said. "Natalie is right," Ethan continued, his voice gaining a little more traction. "She has her own career. She wants to keep her finances separate. That protects us too, right? If she gets sued, the family is safe. That is what you wanted." Margaret looked between us. She was calculating. She realized she had pushed too hard and that Ethan was nearing a breaking point. But more importantly, she looked at me with a profound sense of dismissal. She thought about my little job, my small apartment, my student loans. She thought I was fighting to protect pennies. "Fine," she said, tossing her napkin onto the table. "If you want to be stubborn about your little checking account, Natalie, go ahead. I just hope you realize that by separating yourself, you are also separating yourself from the generosity of this family." I signed the paper right there before the quartzas even got cold. Margaret signed as a witness, her pen scratching into the paper like a claw. She thought she had won by cutting me out a fortune. She had no idea she had just signed a document that would one day prevent her from touching a net worth that would dwarf her own liquid assets. The wedding was a spectacle. It was held in the grand ballroom of the club. There were 500 guests, and I knew maybe 20 of them. The flowers alone cost more than my mother made in a year. I walked down the aisle in a designer dress that Margaret had bullied me into choosing because my original choice was too simple. But I had my small victories. I chose the song and indie acoustic track that Margaret hated, and when we exchanged vows, I did not use the standard script. I vowed to be Ethan's partner, his equal and his anchor. I did not vow to obey. During the reception, Margaret took the microphone for a toast. She stood in the spotlight, holding a glass of vintage champagne, looking every inch the matriarch. "We are so happy to welcome Natalie," she said, her voice dripping with performative sweetness. "It is a relief to know that Ethan has found someone to settle down with. And Natalie, darling, I know you have worked so hard your whole life, but tonight you can relax. You are cold now. You will never have to worry about money again. You can just focus on being a good wife to my son." The room laughed. It was a polite, wealthy ripple of laughter. They saw it as a joke about a poor girl hitting the jackpot. I stood there freezing my smile in place, clutching Ethan's hand. I saw the look in her eyes. It was a declaration of ownership. She was telling the world that she had bought me. She was telling me that my struggle was over because my utility was now solely domestic. I raised my glass to her, but inside I was making a vow that had nothing to do with marriage. You will never own me, I thought, and you will never know how much I am actually worth until it is too late. That night, in the honeymoon suite, Ethan fell asleep almost immediately. The exhaustion of managing his mother's expectations had drained him. He looked peaceful, his breathing slow and rhythmic. I brushed a strand of hair off his forehead and felt a surge of love for him. He was a good man trapped in a gilded web. But love was not enough. Love was a variable, not a constant. I slipped out of bed and walked to the small desk in the corner of the room. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the darkness. I logged into my brokerage account. I logged into the employee portal for the startup I had quietly joined. Checking the vesting schedule of my options, I updated my personal spreadsheet, the one labeled Projected Growth XLSX. I looked at the numbers. They were small compared to the coal empire, but they were growing. They were mine. I am not doing this because I do not trust you, Ethan. I whispered to the sleeping room. I am doing this because I have seen what happens to women who forget to keep a key to their own exit. I closed the laptop, hid it in my bag, and climbed back into bed. I lay there in the dark, listening to the ocean outside, feeling the cold weight of the diamond on my finger, and knew that the war had just begun. The ink on our marriage license was barely dry when I realized that I had not just moved into a new house with Ethan. I had moved into a satellite office of the coal empire. Our house was a beautiful two-story colonial in a leafy suburb. It was picture perfect, mostly because Margaret had selected the neighborhood, the architect, and crucially the down payment. We paid the mortgage, but the down payment had been a wedding gift from the family trust. I learned very quickly that in the Cole family, a gift is never just a gift. It is a lie on your autonomy. Margaret had a key. Of course she did. She claimed it was for emergencies, but apparently an emergency included checking if my spice rack was alphabetized correctly. I came home one Tuesday evening after a brutal 10-hour day at Northline to find her standing in my kitchen. She was wearing a crisp linen suit, holding a label maker like a weapon. "Natalie," she said, not looking up. I moved the pastor to the lower cabinet. "It makes no sense to keep carbohydrates at eye level. It encourages snacking." I stood in the doorway, my bag heavy on my shoulder. "Margaret, please call before you come over. We talked about this." She waved a hand dismissively. "I was in the neighborhood meeting with our estate planner. Besides, I noticed your mail was piling up. I brought it inside. I also noticed a bill for a gym membership. Ethan never uses the gym. You really should cancel that. It is a waste of resources." I walked over and took the label maker from her hand. "The gym membership is mine, Margaret, and the pastor goes where I can reach it." She looked at me with that pitying expression, the one she reserved for slow children and poor people. "You are so defensive, dear. I am just trying to optimize your household. Ethan is used to a certain level of order." That was the narrative. Ethan was the fragile prince, and I was the chaotic interloper who needed to be managed. The invasion was not just physical, it was digital. Margaret created a group chat titled Cole Family Circle. It included everyone: parents, siblings, cousins, and spouses. It buzzed constantly. If I muted it for an hour, I would miss 3 polls about where to hold Thanksgiving and a passive-aggressive message from Margaret tagging me. "Natalie, we are all waiting for your vote on the napkin color." Silence sends a message. You know, whenever I suggested something like going to a cabin in Vermont for Christmas instead of the usual Aspen trip, the message would sit there unanswered until Margaret replied 2 hours later. "That is a sweet idea, but we have our traditions. We will stick to the plan." Then came the pressure to quit my job. It started subtly. Sunday dinners were mandatory, as was attendance at the family church, where Margaret held court in the front pew. During one of these brunches, while slicing into a piece of kitch, she looked at the dark circles under my eyes. "You look exhausted," she said. Is that little job of yours worth it? Working for other people is so taxing. I enjoy it, I said. I was actually just promoted to lead a new project. Ethan makes enough, she countered, ignoring my news. And the family. Trust provides a safety net. You could quit, you know. Focus on making the house a home. Support Ethan. Prepare for the next generation. We do not want you to be too stressed when it is time to give us a grandchild. I put down my fork. I am not working for the money, Margaret. I work because I'm good at it. It is my career. It is not a placeholder until I get pregnant. Ethan, who was sitting next to me, suddenly found his orange juice very interesting. He did not say a word. The real friction, however, was always about money. Margaret operated as the unofficial CFO of everyone's life. She handled Richard's investments. She managed Betsy's allowance, and she assumed she would manage ours. One evening, I came home to find a laptop set up on our dining room table. Margaret was sitting there with Ethan, a stack of papers between them. We are just consolidating, Ethan said quickly, seeing the look on my face. Mom offered to handle the bill payments and the tax filing this year. She has a CPA who does the whole family at a discount. I have my own accountant, I said, dropping my keys on the counter. Nonsense, Margaret said, typing away. It is inefficient to have separate filings. I'm setting up a family master account. All income flows in. Expenses are paid and allowances are distributed. It maximizes our leverage for investments. No, I said. The word hung in the air. Excuse me. Margaret stopped typing. I said no. We will keep our finances separate from the main coal estate. We have a prenuptial agreement that outlines this. My income and my investments stay with me. Ethan can do what he wants with his trust distributions, but my paycheck does not go into a pot I cannot control. It is for tax purposes, Margaret argued, her voice tightening. You are making this complicated. My taxes are complicated, I lied. I have stock options and carry forward losses. Your CPA would hate me. We will keep it separate. I walked upstairs before she could argue further, but I could hear her whispering to Ethan. She is hiding something. Ethan, a wife who hides money, is a wife who is planning to leave. The tension finally snapped at a dinner party 2 months later. It was Richard's birthday. The whole clan was there. The wine was flowing, and Margaret was feeling particularly bold. She had been drinking a vintage Cabernet that probably cost more than my first car. It is just funny, Margaret said loudly, addressing the table, but looking at me. Natalie works 60 hours a week at that tech firm. And for what? The bonus she was so proud of last month. It is what? $10,000. That is less than the dividend check Ethan gets just for breathing. The table went quiet. Betsy looked down at her lap. Margaret chuckled. I just think it is cute. You are playing at building wealth. Real wealth takes generations. Natalie, you cannot earn your way into this level of security. You are trading hours for dollars. We trade influence for assets. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I looked at Ethan. He was smiling weakly, trying to pretend it was a joke. Defend me, I willed him. Tell her I am brilliant. Tell her you are proud of me. He took a sip of water. I turned to Margaret. I kept my voice very low, very calm. Speaking of assets, I said I was reading the quarterly report for Coal Heritage Group, the one filed with the state. I noticed the debt-to-equity ratio has climbed to nearly 400% over the last 3 quarters. That is a lot of leverage, Margaret, especially with interest rates rising. Are we liquidating the commercial holdings to cover the service payments, or are you borrowing against the personal trusts? The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stopped chewing. He looked at me, eyes wide. For a second, I saw a flash of respect, or maybe fear in his gaze. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Margaret had been over-leveraging the company to expand into markets they did not understand. Margaret's face went pale. That is internal business. It is public record, I said, taking a sip of my wine. I just think if we are comparing security, we should look at the liabilities column, not just the assets. Margaret did not speak to me for the rest of the night, but the retaliation came a week later. I was checking our joint checking account. the one we used for groceries and utilities, when I noticed something strange. The login history showed access from an IP address that was not mine and not Ethan's. It was from a desktop computer. Then I saw the disputed flags. A transfer of $500 that I had sent to my mother for her birthday had been flagged as suspicious. A charge for a dinner I treated my college friends to was marked review. I confronted Ethan in the living room. "Did you give your mother the password to our joint account?" I asked. Ethan looked up from his iPad. He looked guilty immediately. "She just wanted to see," he mumbled. "She said she wanted to make sure we were budgeting correctly. She saw some transfers she didn't recognize. She flagged a birthday gift to my mother as suspicious." "Ethan," I shouted, "she is reading my transactions. She is watching every coffee I buy. That is a violation of privacy. You are overreacting." Ethan said, standing up, "She's just trying to help. She says you are spending a lot on outsiders. She just wants to make sure you aren't being taken advantage of." Outsiders. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "My mother is an outsider. Are my friends outsiders? But your mother, who treats our marriage like a subsidiary of her company, is an insider. Why are you so secretive?" Ethan shot back, parrying his mother's words. "If you have nothing to hide, why do you care if she looks? You're being so sensitive. Natalie, you are always looking for a fight with her. Can't you just let it go? Just let her manage the book, so she feels useful, and we can have peace." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw a man who was 32 years old, but was still tethered by an invisible umbilical cord made of gold. He did not want a wife. He wanted a buffer. He wanted me to absorb his mother's control so he didn't have to. "I am not sensitive, Ethan," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I am observant." I walked out of the room. I changed all the passwords that night, not just to the joint account, but to everything. Two-factor authentication on every single device. I sat in the dark of my home office, listening to Ethan watch TV downstairs, and I realized the truth. I had not just married a man. I had married a system, a centralized autocratic system that viewed independence as a threat. If I did not have my own money, if I did not have that secret spreadsheet growing on my hard drive, I would be trapped. I would be another line item in Margaret's ledger to be audited and erased at her whim. I imagined a future where I disappeared, where I became just Ethan's wife, and I knew with chilling certainty that if I ever left, they would hold a meeting about it. They would take minutes, and they would vote on how to erase me. I opened my laptop and worked until 3:00 in the morning. I was not just building a career anymore. I was building a war chest. The promotion at Northline changed everything. I was named lead architect for Project Orion, a classified partnership with a startup called Helio Bridge Labs. The new contract came with a salary bump that would have made my father faint, plus a performance bonus structure that was frankly obscene. I didn't tell Ethan. I didn't tell anyone in the family. I had learned my lesson in the coal ecosystem. My success was not a celebration. It was a threat. It was proof that I didn't need them. And to Margaret, independence was synonymous with treason. The turning point happened at the 4th of July BBQ. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal and expensive sunscreen. I was standing near the hydrangeas holding a plastic cup of lemonade, talking on the phone with my college roommate, Sarah, who now worked in hedge funds in New York. "It is wild, Sarah," I said, laughing softly. "Managing a seven-figure portfolio feels different when it is your own algorithm running it. It is like holding lightning in a bottle." I hung up and turned around. Margaret was standing 10 feet away arranging napkins. She didn't look at me. She didn't say a word, but I saw the set of her jaw. She had heard seven-figure portfolio and my own. By the time dessert was served, the story had mutated. I heard Aunt Linda whispering to Cousin Mark by the cooler. "Margaret says Natalie was bragging about handling millions. Says she thinks the coal money is quaint compared to what she's doing." "Arrogant," Mark muttered, glancing at me with disdain. "She forgets who paid for the roof over her head." Margaret was efficient. She didn't confront me directly. She planted seeds. She watered the insecurities of every family member who felt inadequate. She painted a picture of me as a climber who had used Ethan to get a foothold, and was now looking down on them from her little corporate ladder. The atmosphere in the house shifted over the next few weeks. Conversations stopped when I entered the rooms. Group chats went silent. Ethan became distant, spending more evenings at his mother's house, helping with paperwork. Then came the phone call. I was working from home, sitting in the breakfast nook. Margaret had come over to drop off some mail she claimed had been sent to her address by mistake, a blatant lie as she had likely intercepted it. She was in the living room, thinking I was upstairs on a conference call. I walked down quietly to get water and stopped in the hallway. "She is uncontrollable, Richard," Margaret was saying into her phone. Her voice was low, urgent. "If she is making that kind of money and hiding it, she is planning an exit. We have to protect Ethan. We have to separate her from the main assets before she files. If she doesn't listen to reason, we cut her off completely." My heart hammered against my ribs. Protect Ethan as if I were a thief. 2 weeks later, Ethan came home with a forced smile. "Mom wants to have a weekend getaway," he said, avoiding my eyes. "At the lake house, just the family. She calls it a healing retreat. She thinks there has been too much tension lately and wants to clear the air, a fresh start." "A healing retreat," I repeated, looking at him. "Ethan, your mother doesn't heal. She amputates." "Please, Nat," he begged. "Just do this for me." "She says she wants to apologize. She wants to fix things." He believed it. God help him. He actually believed it. But I knew better. I did some digging. I checked our shared cloud calendar, the one Ethan often forgot to sync properly. There was an appointment from 3 days ago meeting with Stanton Associates. I looked up Stanton Associates. They weren't family therapists. They were divorce attorneys specializing in high net worth asset protection. Ethan had gone with her. He hadn't told me. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. He sat there eating the dinner I cooked, asking about my day while secretly plotting with his mother on how to liberally armor plate himself against me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan slicing through the darkness. I could have packed a bag. I could have left a note and disappeared. But then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. 2:00 a.m. It was a text from Lee, Ethan's younger cousin. Lee was the black sheep, an artist who lived in a studio apartment and refused to work for the family business. We rarely spoke, but we shared a mutual silent understanding of being outsiders. "Lee, you need to know. Aunt Margaret isn't planning a party. She's been calling everyone. She's talking about a family vote." A vote on what?" "Lee, on you. She's going to ask the family to vote on whether you stay in the inner circle. She wants to humiliate you into quitting the marriage or signing a new contract. Don't go, Nat. It's a trap." I stared at the glowing screen. A vote. They were going to put my marriage, my dignity, my life up for a show of hands. Anger flared, hot and white. But then it cooled into something sharper, something useful. "Don't go." No, I was going. If Margaret wanted a vote, I would give her a campaign she would never forget. I got out of bed and went to my office. I didn't turn on the lights. I worked by the glow of my monitors. I started downloading. I pulled every bank statement from the last 3 years. I downloaded the PDFs of the Cole Heritage Group's public filings. I accessed the county clerk's records for property liens. I pulled my own portfolio performance reports. I pulled the vesting schedules from Helio Bridge. I'd built a master file. I cross-referenced the dates of Margaret's financial advice with the family company's worst-performing quarters. I traced the loans she had given to family members, loans that kept them leashed to her. I found the leverage points. I found the debt. I found the cracks in the golden facade. And then I looked at my own numbers. My Helio Bridge equity had just been reevaluated after our Series B funding round. The number was staggering. I ran the comparison. I sat back in my chair as the sun began to rise, casting long gray shadows across the room. They thought I was a liability. They thought I was a leech attached to the host. I looked at the spreadsheet. Ethan full estimated net worth, liquid assets $450,000, mostly tied up in trust disbursements he couldn't touch without permission. Natalie Ward verified net worth, liquid equity $2,100,000 and climbing. I wasn't the leech. I was the host. I closed the laptop. I heard Ethan stirring in the bedroom down the hall. I went to the kitchen and started the coffee. When he walked in, sleepy-eyed and rumpled, I smiled at him. It was the calmest smile I had worn in months. "Good morning," I said. "I thought about the weekend at the lake." "Yeah," he asked, hopeful. "I think it is a great idea," I said, pouring him a cup. "I would love to clear the air with your mother. Let's go." Ethan looked relieved. He hugged me. "Thank you, Nat. It will be good. You'll see." "Yes," I whispered into his shoulder, my eyes open and cold. "I am sure it will be unforgettable." I had my weapon. I just needed to wait for them to hand me the microphone to understand the sheer magnitude of the irony. You have to look at the timeline of my double life. While Margaret was busy criticizing my choice of curtains and calculating how much of Ethan's trust fund was being wasted on my gym membership, I was quietly running the operations for a company that was about to disrupt the entire commercial lending sector. 3 years ago, I had met a brilliant but disorganized engineer named David at a tech. He had an algorithm that could underwrite loans for small businesses faster than any bank, but he had zero business sense. I came on board as a consultant first, then as the chief operating officer and the third co-founder because the company had no money back then. I did not take a salary. Instead, I negotiated for equity, a lot of equity for 2 years. Those shares were just paper. They were monopoly money, a promise that maybe one day, if we did not crash and burn, they would be worth something. I worked my day job at Northline to pay the bills, and I worked my night job at Helio Bridge Labs to build my future. Then came the Series B funding round. It closed 2 weeks before Margaret announced her family vote. I remember staring at the DocuSign email on my phone while Ethan was watching football. The venture capital firm had valued Helio Bridge at a number that made my stomach drop. My stake, which had been worth $0.03 years ago, was now valued in the mid-seven figures, and we were preparing for a secondary sale, which meant I could turn some of that paper into actual cold, hard cash. I almost told Ethan right then. I wanted to run into the living room, shake him by the shoulders, and shout that we were free. We could pay off the mortgage. We could tell his mother to keep her allowance. But I stopped myself. I remembered a conversation we had 6 months into our marriage. I had received $10,000 bonus and bought us tickets to Italy. Ethan had looked at the itinerary, then at me, and his smile had faltered. "It makes me feel like a kept man," he had said, his voice quiet. "I know it is stupid, Matt, but with my mom controlling the trust and you earning all this cash, I feel like I do not bring anything to the table." I had canceled the trip. I had learned to minimize my wins to protect his ego. I told myself I was waiting for him to find his footing, for him to stand up to Margaret so we could celebrate as equals. But Margaret had destroyed that timeline. She had turned money into a weapon, so I had no choice but to turn it into a shield. One rainy Tuesday, I sat in my home office and opened a fresh Excel spreadsheet. I needed to see the battlefield clearly. In column A, I listed my assets. The Helio Bridge equity calculated at the new preferred share price, my 401k from Northline, which I had maxed out every single year since I was 22, my personal brokerage account filled with boring, reliable index funds that had compounded quietly in the background. The equity in the small apartment I still owned in Austin, and rented out my emergency cash reserves. In column B, I listed Ethan's assets based on the tax returns I had seen before Margaret seized control. His salary as an architect was decent, but not spectacular. His savings account, which he frequently drained for lifestyle maintenance, the implied value of his future inheritance, which was entirely dependent on Margaret's goodwill. I ran the sum function. I blinked. I wiped my glasses and looked again. My net worth was not just higher than Ethan's. It was double, and that was a conservative estimate. If Helio Bridge went public in 2 years, that multiplier would jump to 5 or 10. I sat back in my chair listening to the hum of the hard drive, the narrative that Margaret had spun, that I was the poor girl from the Midwest desperately clinging to the Cole family life raft was mathematically false. I wasn't the passenger. I was the captain of a ship they didn't even know existed. And that was when the phone rang. It was Richard, my father-in-law. "Natalie," he said, His voice hushed. Yulo. Yes, Richard. Is everything okay? I need to see you, he said. Not at the house. Somewhere quiet. Can you meet me at that diner on 4th Street in an hour? I arrived early, ordering a black coffee. Richard walked in 10 minutes later, looking older than I had ever seen him. He wore a baseball cap, pulled low, and his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the sugar packets. I am in trouble, Natalie, he said, skipping pleasantries. The company is in trouble. I leaned forward. What kind of trouble? Liquidity, he whispered. Margaret, she has been aggressive. She leveraged the commercial properties to buy that resort development in Florida. The one I told her was a bad idea. Interest rates went up. The occupancy rates are down, and the loan is being called in. We are short, significantly short. How short? I asked. $600,000. He said, looking at the table. I have to cover the debt service by Friday, or the bank sends a notice of default. If that happens, the board finds out. If the board finds out, they will vote Margaret out as chairwoman. It would kill her. Natalie, her entire identity is wrapped up in being the matriarch. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why not tell Ethan? Ethan has no liquid cash, Richard said, and I cannot ask Margaret because she is the one who created the mess. She is in denial. She thinks she can move money around from the family trusts, but that takes time and legal approvals we do not have. He looked up at me, his eyes wet. I need to sell some of my personal shares in Cole Heritage Group, he confessed, quietly off market. I cannot sell to an outsider because the bylaws restrict it, but I can sell it to my family. He paused, swallowing hard. I know you do not have that kind of money, Natalie. I know you and Ethan are just starting out, but I was hoping maybe you know some of those investors from your tech world, someone who might want a silent stake. I can structure it through a private placement. I looked at this man. He was weak. Yes, he had enabled his wife's tyranny for 40 years. But he was also the only one who had ever treated me with a shred of kindness. And right now he was desperate. My strategic brain kicked into overdrive. This was not just a crisis. This was an entry point. Richard, I said slowly, if you bring in an outside investor, even silently, you violate the bylaws. If Margaret finds out, she will void the sale and you will be exposed. I have no choice. He hissed. You do, I said. Sell the shares to me. Richard blinked. He let out a short, nervous laugh. Natalie, dear, I appreciate the sentiment, but we are talking about $600,000 cash by Friday. I reached into my bag and pulled out my iPad. I opened my brokerage app, not the Helio Bridge stock, but my liquid trading account where I had parked the proceeds from a secondary sale last month. I slid the iPad across the shiny Formica table. Richard looked at the screen. He squinted. Then he pulled the iPad closer, his mouth opened slightly. He looked up at me, then back at the screen, then back at me. Is this? He stammered. Is this real? It is real, I said. And it is mine, not Ethan's. Fine. But how? I build risk models for a living, Richard, and I invest in what I build. I have done very well. He sat back, stunned. The image of the gold-digging daughter-in-law was crumbling in real time behind his eyes. I will buy the shares, I said, my voice businesslike. But we do it on my terms. We form a limited liability company. I will call it Aurora Holdings. You sell the shares to Aurora. Since I am the sole owner of Aurora and I am family, it technically complies with the bylaws' transfer loopholes. I supplied the cash today. You pay the debt. Margaret never knows. You would save her? He asked, confused after how she treats you. I am not saving her. I corrected him. I am buying a seat at the table if I own these shares. Richard, I am a voting member of the Cole Heritage Group. Even if it is a minority stake, it gives me legal standing. Richard looked at me for a long, long time. He saw the steel in my spine that his son lacked. He saw the competence that his wife pretended to have. She has no idea who you are. Does she? He whispered. No, I said. She doesn't. Okay, Richard said, extending his hand. Let's do it. We went to my lawyer's office that afternoon. We set up the transfer. I wired the money $600,000 with a single click. Watching the funds leave my account gave me a strange sensation. It wasn't a loss. It was power. I wasn't just paying a bill. I was buying leverage. When we walked out of the office, Richard stopped on the sidewalk. He looked like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, but replaced by a new, heavier realization. "Thank you, Natalie," he said. "You saved the family today." "I saved the company, Richard," I said, putting on my sunglasses. "The family is a different discussion." I drove home with the signed share certificates in my briefcase. I parked in the driveway of the house Margaret had chosen, walked into the kitchen she had reorganized, and greeted the husband she controlled. "How was your day?" Ethan asked, looking up from his phone. "Productive," I said, kissing him on the forehead. "I made a small investment." He didn't ask what it was. He assumed I meant I bought a handbag or maybe a few shares of Apple. He went back to his scrolling. I went upstairs and added a new line to my spreadsheet. Asset Coal Heritage Group Class B voting shares value strategic. The trap was set. Now I just needed Margaret to walk into it. Monday morning started with a summons. I was sitting at my desk at Northline reviewing the beater code for a high-frequency trading algorithm when my internal messenger pinged. It was the Vice President of Human Resources. She wanted to see me immediately in the corporate world. Immediately is never good. It usually means you are being fired or someone has died. I walked into her office, my heels clicking on the polished concrete floor. The blinds were drawn. The chief compliance officer was sitting in the corner. "Natalie," the VP said, not inviting me to sit. "We received a call this morning, a very disturbing call regarding a potential conflict of interest and the misuse of proprietary client data for personal leverage." My stomach turned over. "Excuse me." The tip came from a credible source, the compliance officer said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. "They claim you are using Northline's risk assessment models to manipulate private family assets and are engaging in undisclosed outside business activities that compromise our firm's integrity." I looked at the paper. It was a transcript of a complaint. The phrasing "private family assets," "undisclosed activities," "integrity" had a fingerprint on it. It smelled of lavender perfume and old money. Margaret, she had called my employer. She had crossed the line from domestic nuisance to professional assassin. She was trying to get me fired. "This is baseless," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my hands were shaking with rage. "I have fully disclosed my advisory role with Helio Bridge Labs. It is in my contract. As for manipulating family assets, I manage my own portfolio. That is not a violation." "We have to investigate," the VP said, her face sympathetic but firm. "Until the internal audit is complete, we are placing you on administrative leave. Your access to the system is suspended effective immediately." I walked out of the building with a box of my personal effects. Feeling the eyes of my colleagues on my back, I sat in my car in the parking garage and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. She wanted to break me. She wanted to strip away my income so I would be forced to crawl back to Ethan and beg for the family allowance. She had made a critical error in her calculation. She assumed I needed this job. I drove straight to the Helio Bridge shared workspace. I walked into the conference room where my co-founders, David and Sam, were eating takeout Thai food. "I am out at Northline," I announced, pending an investigation triggered by my mother-in-law. David looked up, a noodle hanging from his lip. "So you are free?" "I am free," I said. "Great," Sam said, tossing a thick document onto the table, "because we just closed the Series C funding. We need a full-time CFO. The board wants you. The salary is double what Northline pays, and the equity refresh is substantial." I looked at the contract while Margaret was popping champagne thinking she had cut off my supply line. She had actually just pushed me onto a rocket ship. "I will sign it," I said, "but I need a week. I had a family matter to settle." When I got home that evening, Ethan was waiting for me. He was sitting on the couch, not reading, not watching TV, just sitting. "Mom called," he said. "I bet she did," I replied, dropping my keys on the counter. "Did she tell you she tried to get me fired today? Did she tell you she called HR and accused me of corporate espionage?" Ethan stood up. "She said she made a concerned inquiry. She is worried." "Natalie, She says you are mixing business with personal matters. She says you are making the family look bad. She accused me of a crime. Ethan, I shouted. It was the first time I had raised my voice in months. She attacked my livelihood. Well, maybe if you were more transparent, Ethan shouted back, his face flushing red. Maybe if you didn't have all these secret accounts and side deals, she wouldn't be suspicious. You are acting like a criminal. Natalie, you hide things. You lock your phone. You have separate lawyers. How do you think that looks to us? To us. I stepped closer to him. Since when is there an us that includes her and excludes me? I am just saying. Ethan lowered his voice, retreating into that passive-aggressive shell he learned from his father. You are confusing the issue. This isn't about her attacking you. It is about you refusing to integrate. You are causing this friction. If you just opened the books, showed her everything and proved you are on the team, this would stop. I looked at my husband. I looked at the man who had proposed to me on a rooftop with a promise of partnership. He was gone. In his place was a terrified little boy trying to avoid a spanking. You are confusing a marriage with an audit. Ethan, I said coldly, and I am done being audited. I went upstairs and locked the door to the guest room. I slept there that night. The war moved to the country club circuit. Over the next few days, Lee sent me screenshots from the family group chat, the one I had been removed from. Lee, she is holding lunch. Just her and Aunt Linda, then her and Cousin Mark. She is telling them you are under federal investigation. Lee, she told Uncle Bob that you might drag the Cole Heritage Group into a lawsuit if they don't distance themselves from you legally. Lee, they are scared. Nat, they think you are radioactive. Margaret was building a coalition. She was isolating me, painting me as a liability that needed to be excised to save the host. It was a classic corporate raid strategy: devalue the target, panic the shareholders, force a sale. But I was not a distressed asset. I was a majority shareholder in waiting. I spent those days in my home office preparing. I did not cry. Crying is not a strategy. I called my lawyer. Prepare the divorce filing, I told him. Do not file it yet. Just have it ready. I want the separation of assets clearly defined based on the ward annex in the prenup. And I want a restraining order drafted against Margaret Cole for harassment and tortious interference with my employment. You are going nuclear, my lawyer said, sounding impressed. I am preparing for a mutually assured destruction, I corrected. If they launch the missile, I want to be able to level the silo. Then I opened the presentation file on my laptop. Cole Family Financial Overview. I added a new slide: external liabilities, reputational risk. I pasted the email from Northline's HR department. I pasted a timeline of Margaret's phone calls. Then my phone rang. It was Richard. Meet me at the park, he said. The one by the river. Leave your car at the grocery store and walk. It felt like a spy novel, but I went. Richard was sitting on a bench feeding ducks. He looked exhausted. She knows something is up, Richard said, not looking at me. She knows I moved money to pay the debt, but she thinks I borrowed it from a friend. She doesn't know you bought the shares. He slid a manila envelope across the bench. What is this? I asked. Internal financials. He whispered. The quarterly reports for the individual family trusts, the ones she keeps in the safe. I opened the envelope. My eyes widened as I scanned the pages. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't just that the company was leveraged. It was that they were leveraged. Aunt Linda broke, living entirely on a monthly stipend from Margaret. Cousin Mark deep in gambling debt that Margaret was servicing to keep it quiet. Betsy, her successful boutique, was hemorrhaging money, and the losses were being covered by the family accounts. They were all destitute. They were all completely 100% dependent on Margaret's goodwill to pay their mortgages, their tuition, and their car payments. That was why they were silent. That was why they hated me. I was the only one who didn't need her, and my independence was a mirror showing them their own servitude. Thank you, Richard, I said, tucking the envelope into my coat. She is going to call a vote, Richard warned. This weekend, she wants to formalize it. She wants a mandate from the family to cut you off financially and socially. She thinks it will force Ethan to divorce you. Let her call it, I said. Natalie. Richard grabbed my arm. She will destroy you. I patted his hand. Richard, you cannot destroy someone who owns the building you are standing in. I walked back to my car, my mind racing. I had the data. I had the leverage. I had the moral high ground, though that mattered less in this family than cash flow. When I got home, the email was waiting in my inbox. Subject: Family Council Weekend. Mandatory attendance. Dear family, in light of recent events and the ongoing strain within our circle, we will be gathering at the Lake House this Saturday for a family council. The agenda is to discuss the future of the family unit, clear up misunderstandings, and reset our expectations for membership in this family. Attendance is mandatory. We will be making important decisions regarding the protection of our legacy. Margaret, it was a summon to an execution. Ethan walked into the office while I was reading it. He looked hopeful. See, he said, she wants to talk. She wants to reset. It is an olive branch. That. I looked at him. I felt profound sadness. He really couldn't read the subtext. He was so conditioned to obey that he mistook a guillotine for a welcome mat. It is not an olive branch. Ethan, I said. It is a court-martial. You are so cynical, he sighed. Will you come? Please just listen to what she has to say for me. I looked at the email again. I hit reply all. I typed a single sentence. I will be there, and I have some data I would like to share with the group as well. I hit send. I turned to Ethan. I will come, but tell your mother to make sure the conference room has an HDMI cable. If we are going to talk about the family legacy, I want to make sure we have the full picture. Ethan frowned. What are you planning? Transparency, I said, closing my laptop with a snap, just like you asked. The stage was set. The players were in position. Margaret thought she was bringing a judge and jury to the lake. She didn't realize she was inviting the executioner. The drive to the lake house was silent. Ethan tried to play the radio, some soft jazz station that usually calmed him down, but the static in the air was too thick to be smoothed over by a saxophone. I watched the pine trees blur past the window, counting them like soldiers lining up for a firing squad. When we arrived, the stage was already set. The lodge was a sprawling timber beast overlooking the water. Inside, the great room had been rearranged. The comfortable sofas were pushed against the walls, replaced by a circle of stiff-backed dining chairs arranged around the large oak coffee table. It looked less like a family living room and more like a tribunal. Margaret was standing by the fireplace, arranging a stack of papers. She looked up as we entered, her smile tight and rehearsed. You made it, she said, as if our attendance had been a probability variable she had calculated. Please take a seat. We have an agenda to get through. I walked to the chair furthest from the head of the circle. On the table in front of each seat was a printed sheet of paper on heavy cream card stock. I reached for mine, but Margaret's hand darted out, placing a crystal water glass on top of it. We will go through the agenda together, Natalie, she said, her voice dripping with that sickeningly sweet condescension. Let's wait for everyone to be settled. I sat back. I looked around the room. Richard was staring at his shoes. Betsy was biting her cuticle. Aunt Linda and Cousin Mark were whispering in the corner, glancing at me and then quickly looking away. Lee sat near the window, her arms crossed, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else on the planet. Ethan sat next to me, but he angled his body toward his mother. Welcome, Margaret began, once the clock on the mantel chimed 7. I have called this family council because, frankly, the foundation of this family is shaking, and when the foundation shakes, the house falls. She picked up her copy of the agenda. Item 1, she read, reaffirming the Cole tradition. She launched into a monologue that lasted 10 minutes. She spoke about how the Cole family had survived recessions, wars, and market crashes because they operated as a unit. She used words like collective security, centralized wisdom, and protection. It sounded noble. It sounded like a sermon, but I heard the subtext. Collective mentor, centralized mentor, protection meant obedience. However, she sighed, looking mournfully at the ceiling beams. Recently, individual egos have begun to threaten that safety. We have seen secrecy. We have seen members prioritize their own little ambitions over the good of the whole. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Every eye in the room flickered toward me. "Ethan," Margaret said softly, "why don't you start the sharing portion? How do you feel about the current atmosphere?" Ethan cleared his throat. He looked at his hands, then at his mother, then briefly at me. "I just want peace," he said, his voice sounding thin in the large room. "I feel like there is this wall between Natalie and the family, and I am stuck climbing over it every day. I just want everyone to be on the same page. I want us to trust each other again." I watched him, my husband, in his attempt to be neutral. He had just handed his mother the hammer. By saying he wanted us to trust each other again, he validated her premise that trust had been broken and that I was the one who broke it. "Thank you for your honesty, Ethan," Margaret said. She turned to Aunt Linda. Linda straightened her pearls. "Well, I agree with Ethan. It feels uncomfortable when we have dinner and Natalie refuses to talk about her work or when she questions your advice, Margaret. It feels like she thinks she is better than us. It is disrespectful to the way this family operates." "I see." Margaret nodded like a therapist taking notes on a psychopath. Cousin Mark, the one with the gambling debt I knew about, leaned forward. "It is a secret for me. We all pitch in. We all listen to Aunt Margaret because she knows best. But Natalie, she acts like she is a separate entity, like she is too good for coal money. But she is living in a coal house. It doesn't add up." The accusations circled the room. Arrogant, secretive, ungrateful, cold. I sat there perfectly still. I did not defend myself. I did not interrupt. I reached into my bag, pulled out a notepad and a pen, and uncapped it. The sound of my pen scratching against the paper was the only noise when they paused for breath. "Natalie," Margaret said sharply, "are you taking minutes?" "Just notes, Margaret," I said, not looking up. "Please continue. I want to make sure I capture the full scope of the feedback." It drove them insane. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to scream. They wanted to fight so they could point at me and say, "See, she is unstable." But my silence was a mirror, and they were starting to dislike what they saw in it. Lee spoke up. "Can we stop this? This isn't a meeting. It is a firing squad." "Lee." Margaret snapped, her eyes flashing. "If you cannot contribute constructively, you may leave and take your tuition check with you." Lee shut her mouth, her face turning red. The threat was naked and immediate. "Now," Margaret said, clasping her hands, "since we have identified the problem, a lack of transparency and alignment, I have prepared a solution, a path forward." She reached under the table and pulled out a stack of documents. She passed them around. I took the paper. It was titled "The Cole Family Commitment Pledge." I scanned the text. It was horrifying. It demanded that every family member grant Margaret full viewing and auditing rights to all personal bank accounts, investment portfolios, and tax filings. It stipulated that any expenditure over $10,000 required prior consultation with the family head. It had a clause about lifestyle alignment that essentially gave her veto power over career choices if they interfered with family obligations. "This is the new standard," Margaret announced. "We sign this and we become one unit again, safe, protected, transparent." Betsy held the paper with trembling fingers. "Mom, this says you have to approve our vacation budget. It is for your own good." "Betsy," Margaret said soothingly, "you overspent in Carba last year. I am just helping you stay on track." "And if we don't sign?" Betsy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Margaret smiled. But it was a smile that promised winter. "Well," she said, "then we have to ask ourselves if that person really wants to be part of this family. We cannot support people who actively work against our security. If you don't sign, you are effectively resigning from the Cole Circle. No access to the trust, no access to the properties, no safety net." The room went cold. It was an ultimatum. Sign over your freedom or starve. Margaret turned to me. "Natalie, this was drafted with you in mind to help you integrate. Will you sign?" I placed the paper on the table. I smoothed it out with my palm. "No," I said, "I will not." Margaret didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. She had expected this. She wanted this. "I see," she said. "And Ethan?" Ethan looked at the paper. He looked at me. He looked at his mother. He was sweating. "Mom," he said, "can't we just negotiate some of the terms?" "There is no negotiation on trust, Ethan," Margaret said sternly. "You are either in or you are out. Natalie has made her choice. Now you have to make yours." Ethan turned to me. He leaned in close, his voice a desperate hiss. "Nat, please," he whispered. "Just sign it. It is just a formality. She won't actually check your accounts every day. Just do it to calm her down. Don't make a scene. We can figure it out later." I looked at him and I felt the last thread connecting us snap. Just a formality. He was asking me to hand over the keys to my life to the woman who had tried to get me fired just so he wouldn't have to have an awkward conversation. He was willing to sell my autonomy to buy his comfort. "It is not a formality, Ethan," I said loud enough for the room to hear. "It is a surrender." Margaret clapped her hands once. "Very well, since we have a deadlock, we will proceed to the final item on the agenda, the vote." She reached under the table again and produced the crystal box. It was an antique, heavy and multifaceted, catching the light from the chandelier. She placed it in the center of the coffee table. "We will vote on whether to sustain the current membership of the circle," Margaret said, using bureaucratic language to mask the cruelty, specifically whether Natalie Ward continues to be a beneficiary of our time, resources, and protection. She passed out small slips of paper and pens. "If you believe she should stay and abide by the new rules, vote yes. If you believe it is time for the family to sever ties for the sake of our preservation, vote no." This was it, the climax of her campaign. She wanted a majority vote to kick me out, giving Ethan the moral permission he needed to divorce me without feeling like the bad guy. "The family made me do it," he would say. I watched them write. Aunt Linda scribbled furiously. "No." Cousin Mark didn't even hesitate. "No." Betsy looked at me with tear-filled eyes, mouthing, "I'm sorry," and wrote on her paper. "No." Richard sat frozen. He looked at me, then at Margaret. He wrote something slowly. Lee wrote yes, and folded it aggressively. And Ethan, my husband, sat there, the pen hovering over the paper. He looked like he was going to be sick. He looked at his mother, who was watching him with an expectant, encouraging nod. He wrote. He folded the paper. He dropped it in the box. He didn't look at me. Margaret stood up to collect the box. She gave it a little shake, the paper slips rustling against the crystal like dry leaves. "I will tally the votes," she said, her voice trembling with anticipation. "Actually," I said, "I didn't shout. I didn't stand up. I just spoke with the flat projecting resonance I used in boardrooms." Margaret froze. "Natalie, the voting is closed." "I know," I said. "But before you read the results, before you decide who gets to stay in the safety of this family, I think there is one missing piece of information. We have heard enough from you." Aunt Linda spat. "You have heard nothing from me." I corrected her. "You have heard rumors. You have heard speculation. You have heard Margaret's interpretation of my life." I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I lifted my laptop case. I unzipped it. The sound of the zipper was loud in the silent room. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, panic rising in his voice. "Nat, stop." I pulled out my sleek silver laptop. I placed it on the coffee table, pushing the crystal box slightly to the side to make room. "You brought us here to talk about financial security," I said, flipping the lid open. "You want to talk about who is a liability and who is an asset. You want to talk about the future of the Cole legacy." I reached into my bag and pulled out an HDMI cable. I plugged one end into my laptop and the other into the port on the side of the massive flat-screen TV that hung above the stone fireplace, the TV they usually used for football games. The screen flickered to life. It mirrored my desktop, a simple black background. "You turned my marriage into a business transaction," I said, looking directly at Margaret. "You demanded an audit. You wanted to see the numbers." I hit a key. The presentation opened. Cole Family Financial Overview prepared by Natalie Ward. So I said, my finger hovering over the next button, "Let's look at the numbers." Margaret took a step forward. "You do not have permission to show anything on that screen." "I believe," I said, my eyes locking with hers, "that as a shareholder of the Cole Heritage Group, I have every right to address the board." Margaret stopped dead. Her face went slack. "What did you say?" "Sit down, Margaret. I said softly. "You are going to want to be seated for this." The room was so quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen down the hall. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that precedes a sentencing. I watched the performance unfold with a detachment that frightened even me. My internal camera zoomed in on the details. I saw Margaret's knuckles turn white as she gripped the crystal box, her veins prominent against her age-spotted skin. I saw Betsy staring at the table, her pen cap chewed into a mangled mess of blue plastic. I saw Lee look at me, her eyes wide and wet, silently mouthing an apology I did not need. And I saw Ethan, my husband, was looking down at his hands, which were folded in his lap like a penitent schoolboy. He was vibrating with anxiety. He had cast his vote, and now he was waiting for his mother to absolve him of the guilt. Margaret reached into the box. She swirled her hand around, making the folded slips of paper rustle against the glass. It was pure theater. She wanted us to hear the sound of our own judgment. She pulled out the first slip. She unfolded it slowly. "No," she read aloud. She pulled out the second. "No." She pulled out the third. "No," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every rejection. It was a drumbeat. "No, no, no." She did not read names. Of course, that would be uncouth. She just let the syllable hang in the air, a monosyllabic eviction notice. Then she pulled out the last slip, Ethan's slip. She unfolded it. She paused. Her eyes flicked to Ethan, then to the group. A small, benevolent smile touched her lips. "Ethan has voted blank," she announced softly. Ethan's head snapped up. I saw the relief wash over him. He thought he had escaped. He thought he had managed to stay neutral. But Margaret was not done. However, she continued, her voice turning syrupy. "In this family, indecision is a plea for guidance. Since Ethan is clearly too torn by emotion to see the objective truth, I will cast his proxy vote with the majority. We must protect him from his own confusion." She crumpled the paper and dropped it on the table. "The motion carries," she declared. "The family has voted. The majority does not feel safe with Natalie remaining in our financial or social inner circle." She looked at me expecting tears. She expected me to beg. She expected me to look at Ethan and plead for him to stand up, but I did not look at Ethan. He had ceased to be a factor in my equation. "So, let me clarify," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a laser. "What does that mean? Specifically," Margaret smoothed her cardigan, "it means, Natalie, that unless you sign the transparency agreement and submit to family oversight, you are no longer a beneficiary of the coal infrastructure, no access to the properties, no safety net, and should you choose to leave the marriage, you will find no support here. You will be on your own." She folded her hands. The verdict was delivered. I looked at her, and then, for the first time that night, I smiled. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just watched the prey walk into the cage and lock the door from the inside. "Perfect," I said. The word hung in the air. Margaret blinked. Betsy shifted in her chair. "Perfect," Margaret repeated, confused. "Yes," I said. "If we are making decisions based on safety and financial viability, then we need to be thorough. Since you have just voted on my value to this family, it is only fair that I show you exactly what you just voted against." I hit the space bar on my laptop. The massive television screen above the fireplace flashed. The black screen was replaced by a stark white slide with crisp blue graphics. Slide 1. Coal Family Risk Dependency Profile. A collective gasp went through the room. It was not a slide of pictures. It was a bar chart. I stood up and walked toward the screen, using my hand to gesture like a meteorologist tracking a hurricane. This chart represents the percentage of annual income for each household that is derived from independent earnings versus coal family distributions. I explained calmly. I pointed to the first bar. It was tall and read, "Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob." I said, 92% of your lifestyle is funded by Margaret's monthly transfers. You generate 8% independently. You are not partners in this family. You are dependent. Linda let out a strangled noise. I pointed to the next bar. Cousin Mark, 100% dependency plus a debt service ratio that is frankly alarming. Mark turned bright red and slumped in his chair. I moved down the line. Betsy 80% dependency. Then I pointed to the two bars at the end. Ethan Cole. I said the bar was split. 40% independent earnings, 60% family subsidy, and finally, the last bar. It was solid blue. It reached the top of the graph. Natalie Ward. I said 0% dependency, 100% independent generation. I turned back to the room. You just voted to expel the only person in this room who actually pays for her own life. I said, you voted for safety. But looking at this chart, I am the only one who is actually safe. The rest of you are one bad mood away from bankruptcy. Margaret stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. This is outrageous, she shouted. Where did you get these numbers? This is private family data. I ignored her. I hit the space bar again. Slide 2. Cole Heritage Group. Debt to asset ratio. 5-year trend. The screen changed. This time it was a line graph. A red line was trending sharply upward, crossing a flat gray line. Let us talk about the source of that safety you are all so worried about. I said, my voice dropping an octave. This is the financial health of the family engine. I saw Richard stiffen. He knew this graph. He lived this graph. Margaret, I said, looking at her, you tell everyone that the family is a fortress. But this red line, that is leverage, that is debt. Over the last 3 years, while you were buying resorts in Florida and judging my gym membership, the company has taken on 400% more debt. I pointed to the intersection point. We are currently leveraged at a rate that would make a junk bond trader nervous. I said, the assets are liquid. The cash is gone. The dividends you all rely on, they are being paid out of debt, not profit. You are eating the sea corn. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was the silence of a bomb squad watching a timer countdown. Aunt Linda looked at Margaret, her eyes wide with horror. Margaret, is that true? Margaret was shaking. Her hands were gripping the back of her chair so hard, I thought the wood might snap. She is lying. Margaret shrieked. She has no right. She stole internal documents. She is a corporate spy. Ethan, make her stop. Ethan looked at the screen. He looked at the red line climbing toward disaster. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. I am not a spy. Margaret, I said, my voice cool and steady, and I did not steal anything. I tapped the screen where a small footnote was cited in the corner. This is all public record. I said state filings, line searches, quarterly disclosures. Anyone with an internet connection and the ability to read a balance sheet could see this. The only reason you didn't know is because you never looked. You trusted the narrative instead of the data. I walked back to the laptop. My finger hovered over the next key. Margaret was panting now, her chest heaving. She looked trapped. She looked at Richard silently pleading for him to shut me down. But Richard was staring at the floor, refusing to intervene. I have one more slide, I said softly. I looked at the room. I looked at the faces of the people who had just voted to discard me. They were terrified. They were realizing that the boat they were on was sinking, and they had just thrown the only person with a life vest overboard. You wanted to know my value, I said. You wanted to know if I was worth keeping. I looked at Margaret. You think I'm a gold digger? Margaret, you think I am here to siphon off your wealth. I pressed the key. The final slide appeared. Net worth overview. Individual V's family system. The air left the room. It didn't just leave. It was sucked out by the sheer gravitational pull of the numbers on the screen. On the screen, 2 lines stretched across a grid that measured time in years and value in millions of dollars. The gray line Ethan Cole personal assets was flat. It undulated slightly, rising with trust disbursements and dipping with lifestyle spending, hovering permanently around the $450,000 mark. It was a comfortable line, a safe line, but the blue line labeled Natalie Ward, verified personal equity, started at 0. It stayed low for the first 2 years, hugging the bottom of the graph. Then, at the 3-year mark, coinciding with the series of funding of Helio Bridge, it began to climb. In year 4, it crossed the gray line, and in the final quarter, coinciding with the Series B valuation I had received just last week, it went vertical. The blue line did not just cross the gray line, it eclipsed it. It soared past the $1 million mark, passed 2 million and settled at a current valuation that was more than double Ethan's entire net worth. The silence in the room was no longer heavy. It was vacuum sealed. "What is this?" Aunt Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that real money?" "It is equity," I said, my voice calm, projecting to the back of the room. "It is the current valuation of my shares in Helio Bridge Labs, plus my private investment portfolio, minus the mortgage on my condo. It is not an allowance, Linder. It is not a gift from a trust. It is what I built while you were all debating whether I was good enough to sit at this table." I looked at Ethan. He was staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a man trying to read a map in a language he did not speak. "You have over $2 million," he stammered. "But you split the cable bill with me. You let me pay for dinner." "I let you pay because it made you feel like a provider," I said, not unkindly. "I did not hide this to hurt you, Ethan. I hid it because every time I had a win, you told me it made you feel insecure. I wanted to wait until we were partners, but apparently we were never partners. We were just a line item on your mother's ledger." Lee, sitting by the window, let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure delight. She covered her mouth, but her eyes were dancing. "Impossible," Margaret hissed. She was gripping the edge of the table, her face draining of color. "It is fake. It is just paper money. It means nothing until you sell. You are trying to bluff us with potential." "Oh, I am not bluffing, Margaret," I said. "And speaking of real money, let us talk about cash flow." I clicked the remote. The slide transitioned. Slide 3. Household support flows last 24 months. This was not a graph. It was a flow chart. Arrows pointed from a box labeled Natalie Ward, personal, checking to various family expenses. "You all voted to cut off my support," I said, walking toward the TV. "You voted to stop the flow of coal money to me. But if you look at this chart, you will see that for the last 2 years, the river has been flowing uphill." I pointed to a large arrow. "The roof repair on the main house last winter, $12,000. Ethan said the trust was a quid that month, so I paid the contractor directly. I never asked for reimbursement." I pointed to another arrow. "Cousin Mark's legal fees when he got that DUI in Chicago, $5,000. I wired it to the firm so Margaret wouldn't find out and cut his allowance." Mark made a choking sound and buried his face in his hands. "The family vacation to the vineyard," I continued relentlessly. "I paid for the upgrade to the villa because Aunt Linda complained about the size of the rooms. That was $8,000 of my own money." I turned back to the group. My gaze swept over them, landing finally on Margaret. "So," I said, "when you threatened to kick me out of the system to protect the family assets, you should probably understand who is actually subsidizing whom. If I leave, I take my blue line with me. I take my checkbook with me. And looking at your debt load, I am not sure you can afford the vacancy." Margaret stood up abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the wood floor. She looked wild, cornered, a queen whose castle was crumbling into sand. "It does not matter," she screamed, her voice cracked, shrill and desperate. "Money is not standing. You are still an outsider. You are not a Pole. You have no say in how this family is run. We voted. The vote stands. You are out." "Actually," I said, "that brings me to my final slide." I pressed the button one last time. Slide 4. Coal Heritage Group Shareholder Registry Update. The screen displayed a scanned legal document. It was a stock transfer certificate. It showed the transfer of 500 Class B voting shares from Richard Cole to Aurora Holdings, LLC, and underneath a second document showing the sole owner of Aurora Holdings, LLC, Natalie Ward. Margaret squinted at the screen. She blinked. She leaned forward. Then she looked at Richard. Richard did not look up. He was studying the grain of the floorboards, but his posture was straighter than it had been in 40 years. "What is this?" Margaret whispered. "Richard, what did you do?" "He paid the debt." "Margaret," I answered. "He paid the $600,000 you lost on the Florida deal, and he did it by selling a minority stake to me." I walked over to the table and placed my hands flat on the wood surface. "I am not just a wife, Margaret, and I am certainly not a tenant you can evict. I am a shareholder. I own a piece of the Coal Heritage Group, and according to the company bylaws, Article 7, Section C. Any decision regarding the expulsion of a family member from the trust benefits or a change in the governance structure requires a unanimous vote of all shareholders. I paused to let the words sink in. That includes me. Margaret stared at me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. So I continued, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the silence. You cannot vote me out. I have veto power. I am here not because of your charity, but because I bought my seat at the table. I own my place here. The room spun. I could feel the shift in gravity. The cousins, the aunt, the sister-in-law, they were all looking at Margaret. And for the first time, they did not see a protector. They saw a liability. They saw a woman who had almost bankrupted them, while the gold digger she hated was the one keeping the lights on. Margaret looked around the circle. She sought an ally. She sought a nod of support. She found only averted eyes in the cold blue light of my net worth chart reflecting off their glasses. No, Margaret gasped. She took a step back. No, it is my family, my money. You cannot be. I am, I said. And if I leave this marriage, Margaret, I do not want a dime of your money. I do not need it. I will take my name. I will take my assets. And I will leave you with the one thing you actually own. I gestured to the red line on the screen, the debt. Margaret looked at the screen one last time. She looked at the blue line that towered over her son's gray line. The reality of her failure, the magnitude of her miscalculation seemed to hit her physically. She made a sound, a small wet gasp. Her hand flew to her chest, her eyes rolled back and her head, showing the whites, and her knees simply gave way. She collapsed. It was not a graceful swoon. It was a heavy, ugly thud against the hardwood floor. The chair she had been holding onto clattered over, crashing into the table. Ah! Ethan screamed. Chaos erupted. Aunt Linda shrieked. Betsy jumped up, knocking over her water glass. Everyone rushed toward the fallen matriarch. Ethan was on his knees beside her, patting her cheek, shouting for someone to call 911. I stood still. I watched the frantic scene from my place at the end of the table. I saw Richard lean over his wife, checking her pulse, his face a mask of concern, but not surprised. I reached down and unplugged the HDMI cable. The screen went black. The blue line vanished, leaving only the after image burned into their retinas. I zipped my laptop into its case. I picked up my purse. Natalie, Lee called out over the noise. She was standing by the door, looking at the commotion and then at me. Where are you going? What will you do? I slung my bag over my shoulder. I looked at the huddle of people frantically trying to revive the woman who had controlled them for so long. I looked at my husband, who was crying over his mother, already forgetting that 10 minutes ago he had voted to disown his wife to please her. I am going to do exactly what they voted for. Lee, I said, I am leaving the circle. I walked toward the door. But you won, Lee said, following me. You own the shares. You have the money. You beat her. I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. I looked back at the room. It smelled of fear and stale perfume. I did not win, Lee, I said. I just stopped losing. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It filled my lungs, sharp and clean. Behind me, I could hear the distant wail of a siren approaching the lake house. The blue and red lights flickered through the trees, bouncing off the dark water of the lake. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from my secure email. Subject: Helio Bridge Labs. Funding confirmed. Message: the wire has cleared. The valuation is official. Congratulations, Natalie. I looked at the number on the screen. It was real. It was mine. I looked back at the house one last time. Ethan was still inside, trapped in the web of guilt and obligation. I felt a pang of sorrow for him, but it was distant, like a memory of a pain I used to feel. I buttoned my coat. I walked down the steps to my car, my heels crunching on the gravel. I did not look back. I did not wait for the ambulance. I had a company to run. I had a life to build. And for the first time in my life, the only line I had to worry about was the one I drew for myself. Thank you for listening to my story. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to Azad Revenge Stories like this video, and hit the like button to help this story reach even more people.